You will eat the bugs. You will live in the pod. You will own nothing. And you will be happy. Meme-worthy sentiments such as these float about the internet, often being attributed to one Klaus Schwab. Of course, Klaus Schwab has never actually said any of these things to my ability to locate anyway. However, his organization, the World Economic Forum, has published videos and extensive thought pieces on the changing nature of our world and the shift from shareholder capitalism to what Mr. Schwab called in his book The Great Reset, stakeholder capitalism, a system in which companies and governments work together cooperatively as stakeholders in the future of the globe and our shared environment. The sentiments, live in the pod, eat the bugs, own nothing, be happy, etc., have been expressed numerous times as part of this so-called Great Reset of global capitalism. There have, of course, been numerous criticisms of this plan, such as the Transnational Institute, which referred to the World Economic Forum's self-described penetration of political cabinets and claims that, for example, over half of Canada's parliament are WEF-aligned, as being a silent coup d'etat aimed to capture governance around the world. I would encourage you to learn about this Great Reset by reading Klaus Schwab's book, The Great Reset, and its sequel, The Great Narrative, which he touts as being instrumental in moving people through the reset and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. You can learn more about this design from the World Economic Forum's website. The specifics of what they aim to achieve, from equitable world power, sustainable development, environmental and food justice, etc., through the creation and use of the circular donut economics model, and how they aim to achieve these things. For more information on donut economics, you can read more in the book Donut Economics: 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist by Kate Raworth, who helped visualize the concept, and is an agenda contributor to the World Economic Forum, and appointed to the World Health Organization's Council on the Economics of Health for All. However, today I want to address one specific element of this push towards a supposedly greener, healthier, and more equitable and sustainable future for the world, specifically the notion of humans eating insects as a replacement food for other meat products such as cow, pig, poultry, etc. Biases. I have eaten bugs in my life by deliberate intent as part of survival training and as part of local tradition in other countries, as well as novelty snack foods. This includes earthworms, mealworms, a scorpion, and silkworm pupae. In recent years, as I've taken to vegetarianism owing to a combination of medical reasons, after meat began interacting with a chronic pain and inflammation condition worsening the symptoms, this combined with a lifelong love of animals and the thought, if I like them so much, I probably shouldn't eat them. These things taken together, and I'm not going to be eating insects or any other animal anytime soon, outside of the most extreme necessity. For the record, I don't care if other people eat insects, or meat in general. If anything, I lean more towards encouraging people to eat meats and other animal products as a healthy, balanced part of their diet, because humans evolved as omnivores. While it is absolutely possible to eat a healthy, balanced diet without meat or other animal products, it is simply easier and more convenient to eat meat and other animal products owing to naturally differing ratios of macro and micronutrients found between meat, dairy, eggs, fruit, vegetables, legumes, fungi, etc. This combines with the acknowledgement of geographical differences and food availability, as well as local customs, law, religious and cultural requirements, etc., resulting in a simple position of, eat whatever you want to eat, leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone. Environmental arguments. This seems to be the mainstay argument for eating insects, the search for so-called climate justice and equitable food futures for the world. My major point of contention with the recent attack on the food supply and the eat the bugs mentality is that this is not a natural free market evolution in the human diet, and is being 100% pushed from above for reasons of supposed environmental good by international non-elected bodies such as the World Economic Forum. The environmental argument isn't even a good one, as by their own standards, as seen in this image hosted on their website, Poultry produces less greenhouse gases than insect farming. However, because they desperately want you to consume the bugs and not poultry, they suddenly pivoted to differences in protein per pound and every other metric they can measure. The protein per pound argument is often misleading as well, as it will frequently compare processed dried out insect powders to non-dried out fresh meat with all its water content still in place, thus hugely biasing the outcome in favor of insect protein. This is weird considering humans can easily live and indeed even flourish with foods that are still high in protein, but not as high as other things. See for example vegetarians and vegans eating beans, seeds, nuts and legumes. Per pound, these things do not contain as much protein as animal meat. Yet if they are eaten, they are still capable of providing a person enough protein to live, and even thrive in the form of building excess muscle mass when combined with suitable exercise. This may simply require better planning and understanding of nutrition and exercise than someone who is omnivorous. The emaciated meme-tier vegans that people often use to criticize diets such as vegetarianism and veganism very clearly lack this understanding of nutrition and exercise and do not have a balanced nutrient intake. What humans can't survive, however, is the World Economic Forum's projected blasted hellscape land that is going to kill everything on the planet if we don't go back to the Dark Ages in order to reduce greenhouse gases. But as I said, this very clearly isn't about environmental concerns, because those go out the window as soon as you find meat that is better for the environment than bugs, such as chicken farming. If anything, the other metrics the WEF will use, such as land required, is silly. You can free-range chickens around other food plants, such as fruit trees and certain vegetables. This is a form of agroforestry, also sometimes called silvopastures or grazed woodland, and can actually be done using any sort of food animal, including but not limited to cows, goats, sheep, pigs, and any form of game bird or poultry. It should be noted here that one of the main factors limiting the use of agroforestry in a large scale is the relative difficulty in mechanizing the process, given the inherent permaculture style of mixed usage, featuring tree canopies, low plant bushes, and underbrush layers of trailing or root crops combined with roaming animals, effectively mimicking a natural forest, albeit heavily managed with hand-selected species. These things put together can make the use of large-scale farm equipment such as tractors impossible, thus slowing down the efficiency with which crops can be planted or harvested, often requiring hand-picking. Back to the topic of silvopastures, the animals will contribute much-needed nutrients to the soil in the form of their droppings, and some, such as poultry, will actively hunt for and remove pests and insects from your crops, making your yields healthier and more fruitful. Try doing that with locusts. This strategy also reduces the feed required per pound of meat difference, as chickens or other animals foraging for wild food will make up some of that difference in addition to regular feeding. But again, all this points out that this is not about the environment and is something else entirely. To quickly address the other point on this presentation slide so people can't accuse me of dodging or sidestepping an issue, consider water usage. We are not short of water. Desalination is completely possible, albeit energy-consuming if done purely mechanically, though one would think that this is not a concern if energy is being produced by so-called green energy. It should be noted that desalination can also be achieved using zero artificial energy via a variety of other methods, one such method being the freeze-thaw method, where salt water is sprayed in thin layers in freezing conditions. This ice is then melted, leaving behind the salt, and the now salt-free water runoff is collected. This also doubles quite nicely as the centuries-old means of farming sea salt, which can also be done via simple evaporation without the need for freezing, a method that can also be used for retaining fresh water. Underground aquifers also exist. They are naturally self-sustaining and self-purifying. They need only be dug in order to provide clean, safe, naturally filtered drinking water. Combine this with the digging of new reservoirs, something that in the UK, for example, we have not done in decades, and the dredging of existing reservoirs and other waterways to get them back to maximum capacity, this is a relative non-issue. It should also be noted that the construction of additional reservoirs creates the potential for new, green, environmentally friendly, and much-needed wetlands that serve as watering holes for numerous animals, and often increasingly endangered wetland and bog plants. It is no surprise that reservoirs often coincide with and/or work with or are owned by wildlife reserves and other conservation efforts. Of course, this could all be sidestepped by simply holding water companies accountable for the massive number of known leaks in their water pipes, wasting billions of gallons of water per day. But this is simply another example of the general public being expected to shoulder burdens and restrictions on their usage of resources. See the present-day restrictions on water usage during heat waves and the soon-to-be rationing of gas and electricity resulting in closures of or limited opening hours for businesses and potentially rolling or planned blackouts, while large companies see no such restrictions and continue to waste resources and energy in amounts that the general public couldn't hope to match, even if they collectively attempted to be as wasteful as possible. To overhammer this point, let's look once again at this image produced by the WEF, in which they claim poultry has non-applicable greenhouse gases compared to insect score of 2 on their gram per kilogram scale. If we ramped up insect production by thousands of %, that too will rapidly spiral into thousands, if not tens of thousands, perhaps even up into the millions if the operation is expanded far enough. Compare this to the poultry's non-applicable, which is the equivalent of basically 0. Well, a simple understanding of basic mathematics reveals that multiplying 0, even by several thousand, still results in 0. Food contamination with insects. There is a bad argument floating around that certain foods contain insect parts in the form of unavoidable contamination. This is being used by people to say silly things like, "You're already eating bugs. Look, an average jar of fruit jam will contain the equivalent insect mass of the leg of one housefly. This means you should be totally okay with eating a bowl full of crickets." This is obviously wrong. There is a huge ratio difference in insect to not insect mass comparing something like a jar of fruit preserves to a bowl of crickets. Food contamination with insect parts is unavoidable, especially if we're dealing with things that insects like to eat for themselves, such as fruit and vegetables, and those things being processed into other foods, such as the aforementioned preserves. Even if fruits are grown in supposedly controlled indoor aeroponic vertical farms, which seems to be the standard being pushed these days by eco-activists, these are not assured to be 100% pest-free environments. These fruits must also be picked, packaged, and shipped, which is not assured to be insect-free, and then processed in a factory that is also not assured to be insect-free. Although many steps are taken to ensure food safety standards, some level of contamination is simply unavoidable. Laws even make provisions for this. For example, in the USA, the Food and Drug Administration has guidelines for how much contamination of certain foods is allowed. One of the highest regulatory standards is for peanut butter, which is legally allowed up to 4 insect fragments per tablespoon. Other allowances include a unit of canned spinach or its frozen equivalent being permitted up to 50 thrips, aphids, and/or mites, and up to 8 leaf miner bugs. A can of sweet corn is permitted 2 earworm larvae, as well as larvae fragments and shed larval skins. The reason these laws are in place is because it is simply impossible to prevent the bugs from accidentally entering the food chain. It should also be noted here that although these limitations may sound shocking, these are the upper limits that are permitted before the food is deemed unsafe for human consumption. As a result, most of the food you eat will contain noticeably less than this amount, possibly including 0. Obviously, with standards such as these, it is easy to see how the food contamination argument falls apart. Eating a single pinhead-sized insect fragment in a can of beans is not the same as eating a bowl of crickets. insect additives and byproducts in food. There have been claims floating around that certain foods contain insect-derived products. This is being used by people to say silly things like, "You're already eating bugs. Look, this type of food contains an insect derivative as less than 1% of its total mass, and this was by design. It's not accidental. This means you should be totally okay with eating a bowl of crickets." This is obviously wrong. There is a huge ratio difference of not insect to insect. Also, these things which contain insect derivatives, such as food colors, are not being eaten as a major source of protein in the human diet, on account of many of these colorants being used in things such as sweets. There have also been attempts to conflate other insect products to the consumption of insects themselves, such as references to things such as wax produced by bees. This is a non-argument that barely deserves being addressed, but I will do so anyway. Beeswax, something that is made by bees, is not eating the bees. These two things are different. Seafood versus insects. I've seen several people making links to things such as prawns, shrimp, lobsters, etc., and calling these things rather mockingly sea bugs, underwater bugs, bugs of the sea, etc. This is obviously just a mocking attempt at a kind of argument that once again insinuates that you're already eating insects, and as such you should have no objection to eating terrestrial insects such as crickets. This is of course a false equivalence. The first question to be asked here is how many people even eat crustaceans anyway? Well, a study referenced by seafoodsource.com suggests that only 1/3 of people in the UK eat the NHS recommended 2 portions of fish per week. This is of course looking at fish, not crustaceans, but even if we assume 100% overlap of people regularly eating fish to also being willing to eat crustaceans, we're looking at about 1/3 of people expressing their preference. So willingness to eat so-called underwater bugs seems to not be very high. Seafood as compared to insects is not direct anyway. In seafood animals, specifically crustaceans, such as prawns or lobsters, you eat only the meat of the animal. The shell and digestive tract are discarded. As a result, when you eat seafood, you tend to not ingest the shell of the animal. If you do, it's more often than not in very small amounts as a contaminant while you eat the meat of the animal. It should also be noted that the digestive system of the animal is removed as well during processing. Also of interesting note, insects and their so-called seafood variants that are totally the same split from each other evolutionarily multiple hundreds of millions of years ago. They are not the same. Crustaceans, since these seem to be the most referenced in this sea bugs argument, are separated by the evolution of insects by about 400 million years, although the accuracy of some of these fossils is disputed. But if this record of timeline is correct, the first insects originated some 400 million years ago. This would represent the split of terrestrial insects from their aquatic family. Although insects as we would recognize them only came about some 200 to 145 million years ago. By this logic, comparing modern insects to seafood crustaceans, you would have much more success in stating that apes like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, etc. are indistinct from humans, especially since they diverged from each other far more recently than insects from their sea-dwelling relatives, with this split having numerous potential dates of origin given a not complete fossil records, with estimates stating anything from 35 million years to 6 million years ago. The reason for this wide swath of dates is quite interesting and seems to more be caused by not knowing exactly which branch of which ape-human-like thing specifically ended up turning into modern humans. Humans and chitin. So what is this chitin and why does it matter? Chitin is a derivative of glucose, or one of the types of sugar. It is not an amino acid or protein, as I have seen some people claim. This may be down to a misunderstanding of insects being presented more often than not as a source of dietary protein in place of other animal meats. This is actually a problem for people. Humans do not digest chitin very well at all. For an animal to process chitin, they must possess chitinase. Chitinase is an enzyme that breaks down, unsurprisingly, chitin. As with every other kind of enzyme that breaks down things we eat, lipase breaks down lipids or fats, protease for proteins, etc., there is not only one kind of chitin, nor is there only one kind of chitinase. There are several. However, to date, we only know of two that appear in humans, and more broadly in mammals generally. When I say in humans, I mean humans have a gene that encodes for these chitinases. Some of the exact details of this and how useful it is still being studied. After all, simply having one gene coding for something tells us nothing inherently nor specifically about how that thing manifests, if at all. Chitotriosidase, also known as macrophage chitinase or KITE1, and acidic mammalian chitinase, also known as AMCase. KITE1 has no function in the human digestive tract that we currently understand. This has been studied down to the fabled level of molecular genetics, and confirmed that this basically only exists to fight nematodes and other infections in the body, seemingly mostly lungs and skin. This is because many fungi, and thus fungal infections, express chitin in their growth. Thus, using a chitin-digesting substance allows the body to detect and eliminate such a threat. AMCase's role in human digestion is questioned, but seems plausible. We base the plausibility on the fact that we have identified other insectivorous mammalian species that produce AMCase, and unsurprisingly for insect-eating mammals, they produce AMCase in their lungs as immune response, but more crucially in their digestive tract. This can be found in, for example, bats, such as in the study Insectivorous Bats Digest Chitin in the stomach using acidic mammalian chitinase. The current working model of understanding of the function of these two chitinases in humans is that their primary role is in immune functions to help combat fungal and parasitic infection, since chitin is expressed in both fungi and many parasitic animals, such as parasitic insects and nematodes. This has been confirmed in numerous studies. Characterization of human phagocyte-derived chitotriosidase, a component of innate immunity, human chitinases, structure, function, and inhibitor discovery. AMCase is a crucial regulator of type 2 immune responses to inhaled house dust mites, and role of mammalian chitinases in inflammatory conditions. All this taken together paints a fairly clear picture. The human body has not evolved to ingest chitin in significant amounts. Indeed, certain amounts of chitin would be left undigested because of humans' inefficiency at digesting it. This undigested chitin would serve a similar function to dietary fiber, simply passing through the digestive system in its complete form, similar to other non-digestible materials. The human body has a limited ability to process chitin as part of an immune response against attacks from pathogens, fungi, insects, nematodes, etc. There is limited digestive capability of chitin in humans, and this seems to have evolved as a dual purpose with the immune response. Not only can humans process chitin that enters their body via the lungs or skin, but can also handle food contaminated with insects or other chitin-producing pathogens, giving a limited ability to process fungally infected or moldy food, or to handle times when a person may unknowingly consume an insect, such as when grazing on berries from a bush and not thoroughly inspecting each fruit before simply putting them in your mouth. This would be the case for people through most of human history, and is indeed how basically every animal in the world grazes for food. They know roughly what they can eat, and it all goes in the face hole with not a huge amount of discrimination for quality, because quantity and raw calorie count is often the winning strategy for survival. The use of chitin has been highlighted by various self-interested actors, such as cricketflowers.com, a website selling flour made from crickets, as being good for the gut, because they found one study that indicated the consumption of cricket flour increases the amount of gut bacteria, Bifidobacterium animalis. This selling point is of course incredibly suspect, since this gut bacteria can also be promoted more effectively by simply consuming dairy products, and is one of many gut-friendly bacteria used by probiotic yogurt manufacturers such as Danone. It should also be noted that this study had their insect matter supplied by Entomo Farms, an insect farming company making edible insect foods, and thanks the Climate Quest competition as one of their supporters. Since climate lobby groups are all too happy to push edible insects, I would suggest that this study might have a few undisclosed biases. Seafood and insect allergies. Speaking on the topic of seafood as compared to insects used as food, it is interesting to consider immune responses in humans. Seafood allergies are a thing, after all. A meta-analysis, Prevalence of Fish and Seafood Allergy, a systematic review, looked across 61 studies using Web of Science and PubMed and found prevalence of shellfish allergy ranged from 0 to 10.3% depending on the specifics of diagnostic criteria. This is not insignificant. It also raises an interesting question. Can people be allergic to the consumption of insects? A very reasonable concern. It seems that people can be allergic to almost anything, even if very rarely. Thus, it's completely reasonable to question if insects could be a source of dietary allergens as well. A couple of studies have looked into this: chitin and its effects on inflammatory and immune responses, and chitin induces accumulation in tissue of innate immune cells associated with allergy. Both of these studies have found, somewhat unsurprisingly, that chitin can be detected by the human body and is a potential source of allergic and inflammatory immune response. One of these studies specifically goes on to mention chitin expression in microorganisms that are involved in skin allergies. This is very interesting as it reinforces what was mentioned earlier, that the human body seems to have an ability to identify and process chitin not as a mainstay of the digestive tract, but more as a source of immune response to keep the body safe from parasitic and fungal attacks by parasites and fungi that express chitin. The more interesting part of note when it comes to dietary allergens concerning insects is the possibility of cross-reactivity and co-sensitivity. In simple terms, being allergic to one thing can make you allergic to other things. This is normally down to similarities in things such as proteins and protein expression. Some studies have looked into this. Insect food allergy and allergens, insect allergens on the dining table, and allergic risks of consuming edible insects, a systematic review. All of these studies have raised concerns regarding cross-reactivity and co-sensitivity between edible insects, crustaceans, and house dust mites. This indicates that if people have shellfish allergies, they are at increased risk of having or developing an allergy to edible insects and vice versa. More worryingly is the potential for cross-reactivity between edible insects and dust mites. There is concern that eating insects regularly may encourage the development of allergies to other common household bugs, such as dust mites. It goes without saying that if this were to happen, this would be a major issue for those affected. Dust mites are small enough to be inhaled in their entirety. However, it is more common to inhale their feces and shed skin. This is one of the most common allergy and asthma triggers in the home. This is part of the reason the human body possesses its chitin-finding and destroying enzymes, as mentioned earlier. If regular insect consumption leads to co-sensitivity to dust mites, this would lead to an increase in respiratory problems in affected people, and also require either extreme cleanliness of all environments, or cause that person to have to wear face masks or other coverings for the remainder of their life. Another possible outcome of increases in chitin allergies caused by an uptick in insect consumption is the possibility of also rendering people allergic to mushrooms and other fungi, further limiting their diet and potentially reducing their immune response to certain infections if those pathogens express chitin. Chitosan. Adding to sections about digestion of chitin and its effects on the human body, note chitosan, a derivative of chitin used in medical dressings because it forms a gel. It also serves a function in some packaging products. Chitosan, which is found in insects, has the potential to interact with warfarin, a common blood thinner. There are also concerns that chitosan may inhibit the uptake of other nutrients. notably fat, and therefore potentially fat-soluble nutrients, such as vitamins A, D, E, and K. This is currently not well supported by evidence, and is one of these marketing claims used by companies to sell Chitosan as a weight loss supplement. The evidence is not strong. However, it should be noted that a diet including large amounts of insect matter may increase chitosan levels far beyond what is currently being studied, and so may lead to unintended outcomes, such as blocking fat-soluble nutrients. This is something for which at current there is simply not enough data to make firm claims about. The European Food Safety Authority's panel on dietetic products, nutrition, and allergies set the maximum recommended daily intake of chitosan at 3 grams. There is currently no recommended maximum amount established in the United States. While studies have shown chitosan supplementation to be generally safe in adults, the doses studied range widely, from 0.34 to 3.4 grams of chitosan per day. Therefore, there's no consensus on the most effective or safe intake for chitosan, but staying below the 3-gram maximum set by the European safety authorities may be a good reference. It will be interesting to see how, or even if, food safety standards will shift in response to this push for edible insects. Insect parasitic load versus animal parasitic load. When looking into general food safety, it would be helpful to compare insects to other food animals. Do they, for example, have differing amounts of parasites or other pathogens? How many of these can be transferred to humans if they do? The answer is insects contain a contamination load in the form of parasites, and this load is far higher than meat animals. While many of the insect parasites cannot transfer to humans, regardless of if you eat them or not, there are some that can. There are several risks associated with insect consumption. In the case of crickets, which appear to be one of the more pushed insects, E. coli and Salmonella. Cricket feces can also contain worms that are flesh-eating in humans and will cause rashes and sores. Things like this are especially worrying when studies such as a parasitological evaluation of edible insects and their role in the transmission of parasitic diseases to humans and animals found. The experimental material comprised samples of live insects from 300 household farms and pet stores, including 75 mealworm farms, 75 house cricket farms, 75 Madagascar hissing cockroach farms, and 75 migrating locust farms. Parasites were detected in 81% of the examined insect farms. In 68.67% of the cases, the identified parasites were pathogenic for insects only. In 35.33% of cases, parasites were potentially parasitic for animals, and in 30.33% of cases, parasites were potentially pathogenic for humans. Edible insects are an underestimated reservoir of human and animal parasites. Our research indicates the important role of these insects in the epidemiology of parasites pathogenic to vertebrates. Conducted parasitological examination suggests that edible insects may be the most important parasite vector for domestic insectivorous animals. According to our studies, the future research should focus on the need for constant monitoring of studied insect farms for pathogens, thus increasing food and feed safety. This study would seem to indicate what was previously stated in this video. Most of the parasitic load of farmed insects is not harmful to humans. However, there is a percentage, in this case 30.33%, that is explicitly pathogenic for humans. I'd also personally posit that the 35.33% as parasitic for animals to be of potential risk to humans because humans are animals. However, this is of course subject to the specifics of what exactly those parasites are, leaving this as a bit of a grey area. Further to this, a few other studies have looked at insects being sold specifically for human consumption. Microbial community assessment of mealworm larvae and grasshoppers sold for human consumption. This study noted a distinct lack of research in this area of study given the relative newness of the concept of mass farming insects for human consumption. They also noted that they found a very high rate of microbial counts that could be harmful to humans, and suggested edible insects would need strict pre-processing, read sterilization, pre-cooking, or pre-digestion, to make them safe for human consumption. Current knowledge on the microbiota of edible insects intended for human consumption, a state-of-the-art review, was another study noting high rates of potentially harmful pathogens in insects, and calls for various treatments for them to be made safe for humans, listing such treatments as starvation, rinsing, thermal treatments, chilling, drying, fermentation, and marination, both alone and sometimes in combination, to render insects safe for human consumption. Bomix mori, silkworms from a food safety perspective, a systematic review, looked at food safety concerning silkworm pupae. They found up to 70% contamination rates in insects across 65 records. These included both food-borne pathogens that are harmful to humans, and more interestingly, since it is specific to this study, heavy metal poisoning. However, they must once again conclude, scientific evidence regarding microbiological and chemical hazards of silkworm, relevant for food safety, is very limited. In the present work, microbiological and chemical hazards relevant for food safety were identified in silkworm. However, their presence do not impair the use as food, but suggest the need for a risk assessment under specific conditions of production and use. Allergic reactions are possible in sensitive individuals following the ingestion of edible silkworms. The picture being painted here from the limited research available is that rates of pathogens and contamination in insects being bred for human consumption are high. This may or may not be a problem. After all, many pathogens can be denatured or outright destroyed by a variety of processes, as noted earlier, starving the insects before slaughter, rinsing, thermal treatments, chilling, drying, fermentation, and marination, both alone and sometimes in combination. However, this does lead us to the question, why put in all of this effort to make insects safe for human consumption if there are safer alternatives available? Once again, we must go back to referencing the so-called environmental argument. Adding in more stages of processing of a food item requires more energy. There is also the long-standing knowledge that highly processed foods are less nutritious and more harmful to people, seemingly by default. Compare this to certain other animals kept for meat. For example, the study intestinal parasitic infections in pigs and beef cattle in rural areas in Cheongcheongnam-do, Korea. Obviously of limited interest to people in the Western world, given this only focuses on Korean meat, but this gives you an idea of a nation with lower standards of food hygiene and safety. They found the overall positive rates of intestinal parasites among pigs and beef cattle were 73.5% and 4.8% respectively, and the double infection rate was 10.3% in pigs. So a parasitic load in general of 68% in insects in first world nations, compared to a 73% for pigs and 4.8% for cows in a second world rural area. It should be noted that the unusually high presence in pig parasitic load in this study was noted as coming from B. coli, a disease that this study notes is significantly more prevalent in tropical and subtropical regions. The study also notes, estimates of the worldwide prevalence of B. coli infection are usually less than 1%, so it would seem that a fair portion of this high rate of pig viral load in this study is a global outlier related to specific farming practices and problems in Korea. Closer to home, a study done in Greece, survey of gastrointestinal parasitic infection of beef cattle in regions under Mediterranean weather in Greece, found the highest rate of parasitic load in beef cows to be 46%, though it should be noted this is a coccidian infection that is of no risk to humans. The leading kind of coccidian that is of risk to humans is Toxoplasma gondii, which, as many are aware, is something humans can very rarely get from cats and dogs, and is often of very little risk, resulting in only mild flu-like symptoms at worst. The only real risk toxoplasmosis poses, that's the name for infection with this parasite, is to pregnant women. The next highest parasitic load in this Greek study was helminth eggs at 16% of samples. Helminth eggs, often simply known as worms, be they fluke, tape, or round. In attempting to find numbers specific to Europe and America, I was actually unable to find data on this after several days of searching. My only conclusion from this is simply that Western nations have such high standards of animal welfare and food safety that these things are simply not an issue anymore, and kept at such low rates that it is not worth continuing an ongoing study. The other conclusion could also be that in Western nations such studies are undertaken by very specialized or specific organizations, and thus are not widely studied, limiting the sources of such information to places and people I have simply been unable to find. A conclusion to this section. The main takeaway you should be seeing here is that land mammals that are routinely used for meat, the parasites that they have that are of risk to humans are almost all located in feces, which humans don't eat, or in their digestive system, which again humans tend not to eat. If it is consumed in the form of offal, it has been removed from the animal in question, cleaned, inspected for infection, often multiple times, and possibly subject to other processing in the form of cooking, and then on the consumer end again inspected, cleaned and cooked, completely separate from the animal it came from. This is why parasitic infection from animals to humans in modern Western nations is so low. The major concern with insect consumption, as it is often portrayed in pro-bug consumption propaganda, is the simple consumption of the entire insect, no butchery involved. This necessitates the consumption of the insect's digestive tract, feces and all. Control, therefore, of intestinal or fecal transmitted diseases in insects will be considerably more difficult, owing to the lack of butchery process and individual inspection of insects. Unless organizations like the WEF are hoping in the future to have a workforce of millions actively gutting every insect before consumption. The intestines and feces of insects is going to be an unavoidable and significantly larger part of the food chain if insect consumption is forced forward as a leading form of protein consumption in humans. If this were the case, this will require advanced processing and sterilization techniques to render any insect safe for consumption in large amounts. This would almost certainly be very time and energy consuming, which brings us back around once again to how this is supposed to be an environmental concern. Farming the bugs is one thing. Transporting them en masse to processing facilities where they are killed, ground up, powdered, and sterilized by UV light exposure, cooking, added enzymes, whatever process it is that must be used to sterilize millions of dead insects and their entire intestinal tract and feces, will require the use of energy. Unless all this energy is coming from so-called renewable resources, this will only serve to increase the environmental damage done by choosing this farming and processing method and food source. This leads on to what could be considered a more apt comparison, which would be comparing like for like in animals for which humans already eat the entire intestinal tract of the animal, bodily wastes and all. This would lead us to consider other animals used for foods, such as snails, or mollusks like clams, oysters, and mussels. In researching this, I located several studies on this topic from Brazil. These were removed from consideration because I want to focus more on Europe and the USA and the wider Anglosphere, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., since these seem to be the nations being most pushed into this eat the bugs to save the world mentality. One study, Assessment and Molecular Characterizations of Human Intestinal Parasites in Bivalves from Orchard Bay, New York, USA, looked into this. Obviously, this study is localized entirely to the Orchard Bay area of New York, USA. They used PCR testing to locate parasite-specific genes in each creature. In this study, the parasite tissues assayed for were Cryptosporidium parvum, Giardia lamblia, and Toxoplasma gondii. These three parasites are known to be harmful to humans. Across all three parasites and all four types of bivalves tested, There was a range of results from as low as 1% up to a high of 60% for both C. parvum and G. lamblia. T. gondii was not detected in any of the samples. However, another study from New Zealand, first report of Toxoplasma gondii sporulated oocytes, Giardia duodenalis, in commercial green-lipped mussels in New Zealand, did find T. gondii in green-lipped mussels, and estimated a true prevalence of 16.4% using Bayesian statistics. However, they do note, as only sporulated T. gondii oocytes can be infectious, a reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction was used to confirm presence of a sporozoite-specific marker, detected in 4 mussels. G. duodenalis assemblage B, known to be pathogenic in humans, was also discovered in 1% of mussels. What we're seeing here is generally a lower rate of contamination than the insects used for human consumption. We also have to consider the relatively lower rate of consumption specifically for foods such as mollusks, and the fact that they are not being pushed as a main source of dietary protein for humans. Conclusion. Moving towards a conclusion on the topic of edible insects, can humans eat insects? The answer is absolutely yes. Humans are capable of putting insects in their mouths, chewing them, and swallowing them. Should humans do this? For now, the answer I think points to maybe, but probably not for a variety of reasons. Of most concern is the lack of ability to digest insects fully, owing to their chitin content. This is before we even touch on things such as bioavailability of nutrients, which, for the sake of brevity, not all foods are equal. Some require more breaking down by the body than others to access their constituent parts, be they lipids, amino acids, or sugars. It is possible that humans may be able to increase their chitin-digesting enzyme AMCase to a high enough level to digest larger than trace amounts of insect chitins. We see other mammals doing this, such as the bats we mentioned earlier. However, similar to other processes, such as insulin spikes following the consumption of carbohydrates and their constituent sugar that promotes the absorption of said sugar, if this goes on for too long or too frequently tied with the consumption of sugar, it leads to the condition type 2 diabetes. It may be somewhat unfair to compare a peptide hormone such as insulin to an enzyme like AMCase. However, I don't consider it unreasonable to express concern about the overconsumption of any particular substance leading to health problems, since we have numerous cases of such things happening. It is possible that a similar problem could arise with the overconsumption of chitin or overproduction of AMCase in the human body. This is something that would have to be monitored closely, and would, unfortunately, more than likely take numerous years, possibly even decades, for results to manifest. If this is the case, and we discover that long-term mass ingestion of insects leads to X condition, and edible insects were pushed so hard and fast that they were forced to become a significant proportion of people's diets, we could be looking at a completely artificially induced wave of illness or disease in the coming years. As a side note, if we remember back to the FDA's requirements for insect contamination, including things such as anything greater than 2 larvae per can of corn, making that corn unfit for human consumption, it will be most interesting to see how cans of insects will jive with this fact. If insects make something unfit for human consumption in one instance, that raises the question of why those insects should be fit for human consumption in another instance. There are several answers to this, but watching the debate unfold will be amusing if nothing else. Another argument which will be amusing to watch unfold is that the United Nations as an organization also pushes the WEF-inspired economic models, energy policies, and social nudges. However, the United Nations also created what they refer to as a right to food, which, as they note, is not a right to be fed, as in no government or authority has a duty to feed any particular person. they do state that people have a right to have regular, permanent, and unrestricted access, either directly or by means of financial purchases, to quantitatively and qualitatively adequate and sufficient food, corresponding to the cultural traditions of the people to which the consumer belongs, and which ensure a physical and mental, individual and collective, fulfilling and dignified life free of fear. It will be most interesting to watch that part about qualitative food with regards to insects unfold, but more interesting is watching the part about cultural tradition of eating bugs clash with the fact that Western nations have no tradition of insect consumption. In fact, they have a tradition of revulsion towards the consumption of insects. This would of course be the UN being openly self-contradictory and hypocritical, but that's never stopped anyone in the political class before. There's also the fact that many residents of Western nations in recent years do come from nations with traditions of insect consumption, which may allow them to sidestep the issue in the name of diversity, inclusivity, and cultural sensitivity. There are numerous questions regarding the environmental argument for insect consumption, mostly due to farming methods of insects often requiring indoor climate-controlled settings, as opposed to other animals such as cow or sheep that you mostly leave outside and they're fine. There is also the concern regarding the processing of insects to make them safe for human consumption and the energy that such processes require. For example, destroying the high levels of parasites and other pathogens, and the breaking down of chitin into its constituent sugars to bypass the potential AMCase problem as mentioned earlier. This would require effectively processing insects into a pre-digested insect powder or paste. This will require a great infrastructural change and no doubt the passing of several new dietary and food safety standards and practices, once again prompting the question, why do all of this when you could just eat a different animal that requires none of this? All in all, I can't help but shake the fact that this is clearly not about being good for humans, nor even necessarily good for the environment, and simply seems to be another part of schemes such as the UN's Agenda 21 Sustainable Development Programme and various other initiatives and programs earmarked for the year 2030, all designed to make our world more equitable, sustainable, smart, eco, green, renewable, and various other buzzwords. I would encourage you to look into those various schemes, initiatives, and plans in your own time, because they are outside the purview of this video topic. However, they are very interesting and provide a fascinating look into the roadmap plan for the future of civilization.